Vou passar a palavra para François, ele vai falar em inglês. O português ele fala um pouco porque ele se casou com uma brasileira, mas tem que falar muito devagar, mas vamos ver depois como vamos fazer para as perguntas. Agora vou passar o micro para ele. E mais uma vez, obrigado de estar aqui conosco. Vai lá.
Boa tarde. As Frederick said, I'll do it in English. I'm very sorry about that. By now I should be able to speak Portuguese, but I'm very slow here, especially with language, so I'll have to do it in English. But I think Frederick told you, if you don't understand what I'm saying, I'm going too fast, or don't hesitate 1 second, just raise your hands and I'll repeat what I said and I'll go more slowly or something like that, okay? But don't be shy to interrupt me if you have to. So, I started to develop what I call a deep relational sociology. As Frederick said, it's ontologically speaking, not politically speaking, but ontologically speaking, it's kind of a radical approach, a radical relational approach, if I can use this expression. And this is what I will try to present and to explain to you today. Why radical? Because I take very seriously, too seriously, according to some people, the processual nature of relational sociology as it should be, I think, as it was announced to at the beginning, I think, more or less. So it goes like that. So I'm trying to develop a deep relational sociology, and it's one type of relational sociology. The relational thinking, more or less, always existed, as far as I know, in philosophy and in social sciences and human sciences and in sociology. But the label relational sociology started to be used, apparently, I'm sure he's telling the truth, but by an Italian sociologist named Pier Paolo Donati. I think we can say he's a critical realist and a relational sociologist. He was very probably the first one to use this label, relational sociology, somewhere in the 1980s. But his first texts were just published in Italian, and it didn't reach so much, especially in Great Britain, Western Europe, and North America, mainly because of language issue, I would think. So in the Anglophone countries, at least, in Western Europe, North America, the label relational sociology started to be used at length and more after the publication of the Relational Manifesto of Mustafa Mirbauer. It was published in the American Journal of Sociology in 1997. So it's quite recent. It's quite new. We're not talking about an old tradition, an old approach, or an old theory here. But again, and as Mirbauer explained quite clearly in his text, in his manifesto, there was nothing really new there. And that's the same with everything I will say here. I don't think there's anything new that I will say. I don't think there's anything you don't already know, because what I'm doing basically is reformulating, translating some ideas that have been proposed, some worldviews, some concepts that have been used and developed, proposed by previous sociologists before. So we were in 1997. Emil Bauer published this Relational Manifesto. The title of the article is kind of important here. For him, it was a manifesto, but not a political one, again, more an ontological one. A challenge that he made to sociologists at that time. And basically he started the text, this manifesto, by saying we have to deal with a fundamental dilemma in sociology, and not only in sociology, but he focused on sociology. We have to, and it's a choice we have to make. We cannot combine. At least this is what he said in this text at that time. We cannot have both at the same time. Or we see the stuff that we study in sociology as social substances. So the classical example is the definition of Émile Durkheim, right at the beginning of sociology in France, when he said the object of sociology is the study of social things. In other words, we should see the stuff we study in sociology, societies, social currents, institutions, so on, as social things, as social substances. So that's one option. The second option is to see exactly the same stuff, the same social phenomena, but in a very different way, as social processes. And Emir Bauer said it's a dilemma. We have a choice to make. Each time we do an analysis, a study, each time we try to develop a theory, each time we propose a definition of a concept, we have to choose between the substantialist approach or the processual approach. For him, relational sociology was still clearly connected to the processual approach. So if we do relational sociology, we define our concepts, we adopt processual worldviews. This is how we should see the world, and we reject the idea, the principle proposed by Durkheim and many others after, that the object of sociology is the study of social things or social substances. Now, what does it mean to study social phenomena in a processual way? Emil Bauer was not very clear about that, I think. He clearly presented the challenge or the dilemma, but he didn't so clearly explain what it means actually to think in a processual way. He mentioned many names, saying it's associated to the works of Norbert Elias, for instance. I think we should be a little bit more specific. In some texts of Elias, it's more processual. In other texts, it's not so clearly processual, but it can be associated to philosophers such as Cassirer or the American pragmatists, especially John Dewey, for instance. And he gave a list of names like that, saying these are processual thinkers. But again, he didn't explain very clearly how we do sociology in a processual or relational way. Today, we can even propose a longer list of works and people that can be associated to relational thinking or processual sociology. Gabriel Tarde, right at the beginning, same time as Durkheim was proposing a sociology of social things, Tarde was strongly opposed to that. There was a big, huge, noisy intellectual battle at that time in France. What is the real object of sociology? What is the best perspective we should use? Tarde was very established at that time. He was older. He had much more prestige than Durkheim, but he lost the battle, more or less. Not completely, but I think we can say that Durkheim won this one. And for many sociologists, it became clear that, not just because of Durkheim, I'm simplifying here, but it became clear in the first part of the 20th century that sociology had to be the study of social things. But relational thinking, even if nobody was using the word at that time, the label at that time, was still there through the works of symbolic interactionism, through the works of more in philosophy of pragmatists, for instance. Later, Knorr, Cetina, Randall Collins in the United States, Bruno Latour, Michel Calon, John Dewey again, George Herbert Mead, to some extent, can be associated to processual thinking, I think. Bloomer, interactionist, Baker, Amsel Strauss, many others. And there's this long tradition of processual philosophy that can be connected to this thing. That's my vision or my conception of relational sociology. If we would stop here, it's still vague, but it's quite clear. The direction of it is quite clear. Now it became a little bit more muddy than that very, very quickly, because I think that's a simple explanation, but there's some truth in it, because I think the label relational sociology became too quickly, probably, as usual. It's not the first time, not the last time, but a fashion in sociology. I would exaggerate it. I would say that most of the sociologists these days associate their own sociology, their own perceptions to relational thinking and relational sociology, but there's definitely more and more sociologists that connect their work, their approach, their theory, their concepts to this label. And we had Pierre Bourdieu at the end of his career, and that helped to boost this fashion that connected his sociology's approach to relational sociology. This book that he published with Loïc Vacan, where it's more partly interviews, partly text. So he made clearly this connection. Harrison White, network analysis, connected also his approach. Charles T. In the last phase of his career, his last publications, and many others. And then you had also the critical realist, Margaret Archer, Roy Bashkar, of course, but later Dave Eldervass. Porpora, even I'm reading his last book now, and it's also associated to relational sociology, or at least relational thinking. And we ended up with this, how can I say, it's not pejorative, there's nothing negative there, but the salad of relational sociologists, the mix of different kinds of approaches, different kinds of concepts. Because, you know, between Pierre Bourdieu and Harrison White, for instance, there's no clear, obvious connections. We can make some relational thinking, but it starts to be very vague, kind of superficial at this level. So, and between the critical realists like Margaret Archer or Donati and Latour, there's, I mean, you would say to these people, you're all relational sociologists, and they will, if I would say that, they will probably deny, on both sides, saying I have nothing to do with the works of these people. So the question. Okay, you're already there? That's okay, that's okay. Yeah. So what is relational sociology today? I think this is a very relevant question, and there's a risk that if we don't manage to define more precisely the approach, but also the concepts, the methods, the principles, that it will die just as a fashion, just as an intellectual fashion, like other fashions died before, or they do not die, actually they stay there, but they lose their influence, they lose their prestige and so on. They lose the momentum that fueled the beginning of it. And if we look at the recent literature, like the last book, for instance, of Archer, I think it's the last one, but the last book of Archer and Donati in 2015, the last book of Nick Crossley, British sociologist, it's relational to my own publications, which are not really my texts, but collections of texts edited by myself, Jan Fuse, and so on. If we look at all this literature, we try from this, by starting from this literature, to define what relational sociology is exactly, at least as a general approach, then it's very difficult to identify any common or shared principles beyond the very general idea that social relations matter, that we should put the emphasis, the focus on social relations. Sorry. I'm coming there, right? So that's okay if it's the, oh.
I gave up.
Yeah, you gave up, okay. So, my point, I guess, it's a long introduction, to say a very simple thing.
You understand? Yeah.
That's okay, just stay there, because that's the next one, okay? So my point, my main argument at this level is very simple. Beyond the feeling or the vague idea that in relational sociology social relations matter a lot, or that we should start from social relations, we have to define more precisely what are the general principles, but common principles, as far as it can be, and concepts and methods do we use and apply in relational sociology. I'm not dreaming, and I'm scared by paradigms. I have no interest whatsoever for paradigms. I think that would just kill social sciences the day we will start to have paradigms, but that's another topic for another discussion. So I'm not interested by paradigmatic relational sociology. I would be the first one to say that's a bad move. That's a very bad idea. Translation, in other words, it means I do not hope that all the sociologists of the world will become relational sociologists. That would be a disaster. Even if they would all agree with me, for instance. But if relational sociology has to develop itself, if it has to lead to useful, relevant, productive sociological analysis, we need to be more centered, I guess, on general principles that we can more or less all agree. And some concepts that we use more or less in the same ways, and some methods that we decide to use more or less in the same ways. So that brings me here. This is what I've tried to do in the last years, trying to identify these general principles and concepts, and I'm not there yet, but eventually methods, I hope, one day, which could become some sort of more solid, specific, precise foundations for relational sociology. I'm not looking for any compromise. I don't think it's possible, and then I'll explain why. But I simply start from the dilemma presented by Mustafa Mirbauer in 1997 when he said we have to choose between a substantialist approach or a relational processual approach. I choose the second option with him, processual. I think we can do a better job than with the study of social things or social substances. And as I said at the very beginning, I take it very, very seriously. Again, too seriously, according to some colleagues. But I'm really interested to see how far we could go and where it can bring us to think in this way, in a radical, if we want to use this label, in a radical, ontologically speaking, again, not politically speaking, but in a radical ontological way. Where does it lead us? What kind of sociology would we end up with? And is it really better than to think in terms of social substances? My answers are yes, 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 and yes, but this is something that still have to be fully developed or more fully developed, and that has to be tested. Now, why can we say that it's kind of radical in some ways, ontologically speaking, again? Because I think, and this is where I lose part of my audience all the time, I started to teach relational sociology years ago, and each time I end up more or less with the same outcome. So maybe there's a structure there, we can talk about that later, but I end up with 40, 45, 50% of the students at the best who agree with me, and the other half or 60% who strongly disagree with me. And the disagreements, where I start to lose some people, it's right there at this moment that you don't see here, because it's a little bit, no, it's the next slide. Can you move? Okay. If we think in a processual way, we really agree, at least we start from this point of departure, then automatically, logically speaking, empirically speaking, and again I'll give you examples later, but we have to reject a common idea in sociology. It's more even like a social, for many of us, a sociological habitus. Many sociologists told me if I would agree with that, I would stop to do sociology right now because I'm not interested. So what I propose to reject, because I want to develop this processual relational sociology in a full way, in a deep way, that's why I called it deep relational sociology, that by thinking in this way, we cannot think that human behavior, social action, call it as you wish, is fully or partially determined by pre-existing social structures or any other social things you can imagine. That, well, it has huge consequences for sociology, I think, not because it's new. I'm not the first one, and I don't think I'll be the last one to talk in this way. I'm far from being the last one. There's nothing original there. But it means that if we agree on that, we have to reject a lot, or I don't propose to reject them, I'll come back to that later, but we have to retranslate, to revise, to reformulate many of our classical texts, classical explanations in sociology, and we have to stay away from some sociological habitus, and it's not It's difficult to do, of course, because it's well established. This is what I would call, or whatever it means, something like mainstream sociology. So we have to criticize, we have to reevaluate, we have to reformulate some it's not sociological explanations usually, it's worldviews, it's conceptions of basic background assumptions about what the social universe is and how it works. In fact, I think, for me at least, the best way to formulate what we have to stay away from is two modes of sociological interpretation that you have at the next slide. Well, the first one is, well, then I don't lose so many people because pretty much everybody agree on that today. We have to reject social determinism. The idea that social structures, or whatever the social thing can be, an institution, culture, society, determines human actions, but fully determine human action. That's something that we could find in some texts of Émile Durkheim, especially the rules of, in English, what is it? The rules of sociological method, where this text was strongly, clearly a positivistic one, and Durkheim, I think, clearly, almost at 100%, not that clearly, but explained that individuals and groups and their actions, their behaviors are determined by social things, which are external and constraining social forces that impose themselves on us. We could find that, not at 100%, but we could find this logic, this social deterministic logic also in many texts of Talcott Parsons. In a structural Marxist text, Louis Althusser, Nikos Poulentzas, that's old stuff now, but like in the 60s, 70s, it was very important in sociology. But again, I think there's not so many people are defending a deterministic sociology these days, so that's not a big challenge, today at least. What is more challenging for me and for many people is the rejection of what I called co-determinism, and that's in terms of worldviews, in terms of mode of interpretation, of sociological interpretation, sorry. This is probably the dominant, well, if we have a dominant approach, this is the closest one. This is the kind of conception or perception of the social universe that is adopted by many sociologists today, and very influential yeah, not in any pejorative way, but popular theories these days are based on this conception of the social universe. What does it mean? It's quite simple, generally speaking. It starts to be much more complicated when we read the text and all the details and so on, but generally speaking, the co-deterministic sociologists agree that basically the social universe, our social life, is made by interactions between social substances, like social structures, usually these days, and the agency of individuals or the agency of groups. There's different ways to formulate that, to propose, to present this formulation, this general formula of the object of sociology, which becomes the study of the interactions between social substances and the agency of people. Some, like Anthony Giddens, for instance, I think is a perfect example of, oops, okay, that's okay. That's okay. Of the first one, where Margaret Archer said about that, and that was a criticism, according to her, that Giddens conflated the causal powers of social structures and agency, meaning we cannot really, when we do empirical analysis, we cannot really distinguish the causal powers of each of these forces. I'll show you a graphic later. But then you have many other sociologists, like Archer and the critical realists, most of them, that present a time sequence to study these interactions. At first, we are predetermined by social substances, social structures, cultures. And at second, you have or you have not the agency of people that is used or not used by individuals or groups most of the time, corporate actors, if I remember well, in the case of Archer. And if the corporate actors do not use their agency, then we assist to the reproduction of the initial social structures. If the corporate actors use their agency, their capacity to act in a different way, if you want, then the social structures can be transformed, and they become the new conditions for social action for the future. We find this co-deterministic logic with Peter Berger and Thomas Luckmann, with Giddens, as I mentioned. Pierre Bourdieu, I think it's complex here, but Nikos Mouzlis, not so well known, but critical realism, and many, many others. So again, if I would have to identify among the three, the social deterministic approach, the co-deterministic approach, and the relational one, which one is the most important one today? It's clearly, I think, the co-deterministic one. But I think processual relational sociology is a challenge to this one, and that's, theoretically speaking, in terms of groups, if you want, or labels, this is probably the dilemma today. Do we go with a co-deterministic sociology, or do we go with a relational processual sociology? If we go with the relational processual approach, it means one implication is another general principle that we should keep in mind when we propose a definition of a concept, when we choose a method, or when we do a sociological analysis. And this principle leads to the rejection of another very common views in sociology and in social sciences, the views that the social universe is a multi-layered social universe. There's different ways, different formulas to talk about that, but usually we make a distinction between the macro level and the micro level, and some people put a meso level in between, but the idea is always the same. There's multiple layers in the universe, and they interact more or less with each other. Again, it's more complex than that, depending on the theory we're talking about, but generally speaking, this is what they're saying. Or it leads to other forms of dualism, like a dualism between the society and the individuals. We have two levels, the level of the society, the level of the individuals. Each level has its own causal powers, and we have to study the interactions between these two. Or social structure and agency, for instance. And there's other ways too, but the idea is always the same. Well, if we go with a relational sociology, a deep one, a radical one, if you prefer, then we're closer to Bruno Latour, for instance. I think he's the one. Told you, I'm not saying anything original here, always stealing ideas or putting ideas together. I think he was the one who said in Reassembling the Social, or another book, I don't clearly remember, but he said the social universe is flat, means there's no layer, there's no levels like that. There's just only one level of thing, which means there's no level. And it's the study of interactions, or relations. Assemblage in this case, or associations in the case of Latour. So we should not try to study the interactions between society and individuals, or the interactions between social structures and agency, or the interactions between macro and micro levels, or whatever it can be, because there's no such thing as levels in the social universe. There's just what I would call interactants that interact with each other, human, non-human interactants. So these are my starting points in terms of general principles. What kind of concepts can we formulate now? With these two general, at least, and others, but at least these two general principles, processual, relational principles in our mind. Well, I proposed the concept of social field, but that's maybe not the best choice, and I'm stuck with it now because I use it in too many publications, but I'm not sure it was the best choice. It's just that it was not so easy to find a good one. But the idea is that the relational idea is that the social universe, our social life, is composed by a multiplicity of more or less interconnected social fields. Now, we could use the notion of networks, social networks. If you start from Elias, especially what is sociology, the book What is Sociology, then you probably want to use configurations or figurations. Assemblage with Latour, Deleuze, Rhizome. Social joints with Herbert Blumer, social worlds maybe from Becker and Ansel Strauss. That means more or less what I mean by social field. So in this spirit, in this logic, by social field, I do not mean what Pierre Bourdieu and Doug McAdam and others have or had in mind when they used this concept. For Bourdieu, it was very clear that the social field was a space made by the hierarchies between different social classes, each class having its own capitals, the economic, cultural, social capitals, and so on. And in this, with this approach, in this logic, the behaviors of, again, it's more complex than that, but the behaviors of the actors, of the individuals, were partly determined by their class positions in these fields, and also dependent on relations of imitation and distinction. That's not what I have in mind here by social fields. By fields, I mean temporary, fluid, dynamic social processes. So it's an obsession. We always come back to the idea of processes made by interactions between human and non-human interactants. And we are used to call many of these social fields in different ways, like couples, families, corporations, governments, states, nations, societies, if you want. I'm not sure I understand really what it means even after 25 years of sociology, but societies, if you want. Empires, wars, genocides, conversations, peer groups, schools, universities, classrooms. This is, for me, here, what we're doing right now, a social field. Obrigado. How does it look like? Well, this is my poor version of network analysis. It looks like that. This is just an example. Again, with all the examples I gave you, you can imagine that it's pretty much everything we can imagine in social life. But in few words, I can say something like that social fields are made by, as I said, by the interactions between the interactants, human, non-human interactants, but they do not exist outside of, that's the main point, they're not external to, and therefore they cannot be considered as enabling or constraining social forces imposing themselves on the individuals. They are constant, ongoing effects of interactions. They exist for real. Many people always tell me, oh, you think that you propose a subjectivist sociology. No, I don't. I do recognize, I'm not crazy, I do recognize the existence of this dynamic right now. I do recognize the existence of my couple, of my family, and so on. Again, I'm not completely detached from reality so far, not yet. But these things, not these things, but these phenomena, these processes that exist for real, are produced by the interactions. They do not produce the interactions. So that's a very simple, just an illustration here, more than anything else. We have two social fields here, so a couple and a groups of friends. Again, that's very simple. And in real serious network analysis, we'll start to laugh at this point, I think. But the couple is made by, let's say it's a simple couple, and their life is not too complicated. Even if it's a couple, it's probably complicated, but not too complicated. They're just two. Right? So you have the actors A and B, and you have groups of friends, the same B, D and C. And these two social fields, again, are constantly made, or transform, or more or less reproduce. I don't think the notion of reproduction really exists, really means anything here. It's always changing, but it's more or less reproduced. It's similar from one day to another. Or it's destroyed by the interactions. A couple can be destroyed, as you probably know, very quickly. It can also be made very quickly. It can last for a long while with a lot of work and dedication and many, many interactions. The same with the groups of friends, but I would argue the same with anything we know about social phenomena, including things that looks to be so stable and so solid, like institutions, universities, or governments, and again, whatever we can imagine. And I'll come back on that a little bit later. I'll just mention them very quickly because I don't want to be too long. And, oh, by the way, you can stop me when you'll be tired. If you want to go to the question, the period question, that's fine with me. You just stop me. But when we study a social field, and more important, it means when we study the interactions that make the social field, then we have to look. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just a list to propose what we should pay attention to. But there's other stuff also, I'm sure, that are missing here. But the dimensions of actions, I'll explain that a little bit later. So you have a list here. And the characteristics of human interactions, you have another list. I won't explain them right now. I'll come back with this graphic and I'll give examples and illustration. The main point so far, if you can just go a little bit lower. The other one is easier. Yeah, this one. Perfect. Okay. The main point, this level, at this point, is the following. This is very, again, with my graphic, the social universe is flat. Just interactions making, constantly making, or destroying, or changing, or reproducing social fields. But there's just one layer, one level. This is very different from many other sociological approaches or theories, which are multi-layered approaches. The best example, and I say it in a very honest way, I think they did a great job. Margaret Archer, for instance, because I know her work better than Roy Bashkar, and she did, I think, a great job to summarize, to represent, to summarize what a co-deterministic approach is. This is, as far as I know, probably the best co-deterministic theory that I know, at least. So, best illustration of this kind of approaches. She started from Bashkar, and she proposed, make a short story, she proposed this general formula. This is not my representation of, but that comes from her publication. She uses graphic many times in many texts. So you have a time sequence here. And the time sequence refers to interactions between social structures. Culture is missing here, but should be added. So social structures and the agency of people, the corporate actors, according to her, years ago at least, maybe not anymore, I don't know. But so you have the initial structural condition in which we appear. When we act in a world that we do not create. It's already pre-existing. We didn't choose it, we didn't make it, and we have to cope with that. So, and we are partly determined by these initial pre-existing structural conditions. Then you have the moments of interactions between the actors, my A, B, C's, and D's here. Right? Me, I'm just at this level and I stop there. Well, maybe with this. But the arrow goes just in one direction, in my case. Actors interact. Well, this is time 2 and time 3 for her. And the dark arrow here represents the agency of the people, of the actors. Now, according to Archer, we'll make a short story, but the actors can use or not their agency. I don't think I'm simplifying here. It's more yes or no. And through their internal conversations, and anyway, that's a complex story, but brief story is that actors can use their agency or not. If they use it, and if they're successful, then they manage to change the initial structural conditions. If they don't use their agency or they're not successful, then the structures are reproduced. And it's a cycle like that. It goes like that. But the main point here is that it's layered. There's levels and a time sequence here. And the interactions between people is just one period in this time sequence. So it matters in sociology, according to Archer and all the others that use a co-deterministic approach. It's very important, but it's still just one moment of sociological analysis. The other moment, the other key moment, is how the pre-existing structural conditions impose themselves on the individuals. Main difference with my flat ontology, my deep relational sociology, and what I consider to be a real, pure, deep relational approach, is that there's no such thing as pre-existing structural conditions that impose themselves at first. There's just interactions between the interactants. Yeah, okay, so I'll be too slow as usual. I'll take too much time. So I'll just skip the next slide, and we move to the other one after. Yeah, this one is just repeating. I just wanted to show you the contrast between the two, but I think you got it. You can switch to the other one. Obrigado. Okay, so With these principles, with this framework in mind, deep relational sociology is the study of the emergence, transformation, and/or disappearance of various, multiple, more or less interconnected social fields. Can you follow me? Yeah, that's okay? Okay, good. Which means, again, sorry to repeat myself, but which means that the social fields are not social structures. They are not pre-existing structural conditions. They are constant. They exist for real, again. They're not subjective stuff. They're not simply imagined by people. They have their own existence, and we have to study these real processes, these real social phenomena, but as constant, ongoing effects coming out from the interactions between human and non-human interactions. What are the interactions? That becomes a crucial issue here. What do I mean by social relations or social interactions between these interactants? Here it took me a long while, again, because I'm slow, not just with languages, but also with concepts, and this one was not easy to grasp. And I think it's still difficult. This book is well, it's a book of philosophers. It's not always convivial and friendly, and this one is not convivial and friendly. It's called Knowing and the Known, written by John Dewey and the American pragmatist I was talking about before, and Archer Bentley. It's not a well-known book, very obscure. It stayed in the dark a little bit, but it started to be more and more cited now because, or thanks to the development of relational sociology. It's published in 1949. And they said we have to see, they were not sociologists, they didn't care so much about sociology, they were not even thinking about sociology, but they were thinking about any kind of interactions or relations between whatever it can be, things, planets, gases, whatever. And so we have to see these relations as transactions. The word is helpful, so that's why I'm not using it anymore, because it looks like economic transactions and so on. But the meaning of it is, I think, very, very interesting. And well, for me at least, it was a little bit difficult to understand for a while, and I think it's still a challenge for me. They basically made a distinction between three concepts, or three perceptions of relations. First one, it's not here, but it's self-action. The idea of self-action, to simplify it, it's kind of simple. A self-act on B, so B is caused by A, period. Right? So you have one-way relationship, self-action, A self-act on B. You have a second possible conception of a relation or an interaction. A and B interact with each other, but as pre-given units. They are what they are before the interactions, and they will still be what they were after the interactions, like billiard balls, for instance. A ball is a ball before, after the interaction. The trajectory of these balls, of course, will be the effect of their interactions on a table, a billiard table, but the balls stay the balls. Their status, their identities, their properties, their characteristics, unless you broke them, but it doesn't change. Transactions are different. Because, and that took me a while, probably because I'm a little bit slow too, but it took me a while to find the right way to formulate that, to define how a transaction is different from an interaction. We are used to think in terms of interactions. I think it's kind of part of our culture, part of our sociological habitus too, but transaction is different because you cannot understand what the entities, the interactants are outside of the transaction. Brothers and sisters, for instance. You can be a brother or a sister only if you interact and when you interact with your brother or your sister. Simplifying a little bit, but you can be a husband or wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever it is, only because you're involved in these transactions. The moment that these transactions are gone, you're something else. Now, it's tricky because many people conclude from there that, oh, well, that's a form of structural thinking. That's a form of social substantialist thinking, because you're saying that the relations or the transactions, the interactions, whatever, are making the actors or the interactants. No, This is where it's tricky, and this is where it's a little bit more difficult to understand. No, because these A and B make the couples, the couple, for instance. As boyfriends, girlfriends, girlfriend, girlfriend, boyfriend, boyfriend, whatever, husband, wife, whatever it can be. But they make a couple. So it's not like the couple can exist without them or before them. So it's not a structural precondition of their action. Hein? Encore 20 minutes? Oh, ok, parfait. So it doesn't exist without them, but at the same time, if you remove them from these transactions, from these interactions, then there's something different. Right now I'm talking to you, so you're an audience, students, professors, whatsoever, and I'm the one who's giving the presentation. Right after that, I'll be probably, I guess, with some of you, I hope, or with Frédéric, at least in the corridor, and I will still be academic, something like that. When we will walk on the street and you bring me back to the taxi to bring me back to the airport, then it will be, oh, well, again, something a little bit different. Tonight, when I'll be with my wife, I won't be the same person, the same personality and so on, but I won't be a presentator, an academic person who's giving a presentation to other people. I'll be something else, a father, husband, a friend, whatever it can be, but always depending on the transactions, but it doesn't mean that I'm made by these transactions. Okay, so the invitation here of John Dewey and Arthur Bentley was, why don't we just learn, or at least try to think outside of these dualism? The dualism between the relations, seen as substances, and the interactants, or the transactants, if we use their concept, as if there would be two levels, as if there would be two things existing without each other. In fact, it's like that. That leads us, I guess, to the idea of configuration of Norbert Elias, for instance. It's kind of close to this kind of thinking. Rhizome of Deleuze, it's kind of close to this form of thinking, to always pragmatists. Of course, John Dewey made these concepts. So American pragmatists who were begging us for years to stop to think in these dualistic ways. And that is, of course, a huge challenge for any deterministic or co-deterministic theories in sociology, because they are based on these dualism. Like if you read Margaret Archer, for instance, she always insists very strongly, very clearly, and in her own logic for good reasons, that we have to be dualistic. Yeah.
Are you saying Margaret Thatcher?
No, Archer. Not Thatcher. I could have a funny story about that, but I won't. Yeah. No, Archer. Later, I will try to use, because this is a draft for publication, an article that will be written later. This is very rough at this point, and I plan to use examples coming from slavery plantations, partly in Brazil, partly elsewhere in the Caribbean and in the Americas, basically. And I'll explain why later, but you cannot understand, the idea here is that we cannot understand what a slave is and why this person is a slave or was a slave outside of the transactions, outside of what I call now the interactions, because it seems to be more friendly, easier to accept than the notion of transaction. And you can be a master, you could be a master only if and when you were involved in relationships with transactions or interactions with slaves. Again, it's a huge simplification. It was much more complex, these social fields that we call plantations, slavery plantations. But that's what it was. The constant effects, the statuses or the identities, in all their roughness and all the difficulties and all the suffering and so on, were the effects, the constant effects of these social processes, of these social fields that we called, again, slavery plantations, where slaves and masters were making them constantly, changing them, challenging them, or reproducing them. And it needed, and I will insist a lot on that, a lot of work, of constant daily work to maintain, to change, to transform, to reproduce, or to create these social fields. So, I come back to my initial graphic, obrigado. And we come back to the dimensions of actions was one of these two lists in the graphic. I'll show you the graphic later a little bit. But now I'm, once again, stealing ideas or concepts from, not stealing, but importing ideas or concepts from other people. You'll recognize quite easily George Herbert Mead here with these three here. So the self, the me, and the I. I think it that was the key contribution of George Herbert Mead here. Not that he was again the first one. There was nothing really fully new here, but the way he formulated these three concepts was, and I think it's still very useful for us. The self is the reflexivity of the human interactance, meaning our capacity to see ourselves as objects. And to see us as interacting with other interactants with my own concepts in specific social fields. You have the me, which is the socialized self. I'm simplifying a little bit here, but that's a general idea. So the socialized self, how do we know what a socialized self is? Well, it's kind of simple. It's the expectations that other people have about me, what I'm doing, what I should do right now. So you have expectations right now that I will not jump on this table and start dancing. That's the socialized me. I know what I have to do because I know, or I think I know, what you expect from me in this dynamic, in this process, in this social field. And you have, and that's a neglected concept for many readers of George Herbert Mead. I don't know why, but they skip on this one very quickly, probably maybe because of the strong influence of deterministic and co-deterministic thinking. But even in co-deterministic theories, I think the I should have been more inflated, more important in the reading of me. This is the capacity of the self to see ourself in a different way. That refers to agency, for instance. The capacity to imagine something different. We know most of the time, or we think we know, what the expectations of the others are. So we know what the socialized self should do in one situation or another, but for some reasons or other reasons, we decide to act in a different way by using our reflexivity. This is the I that becomes more important than the me in this reflexive process. And Mead insisted a lot to say, that would lead to the work of Herbert Blumer, for instance, insisted a lot to say all these capacities of the self, the reflexivity, the socialized self, the creative self, the I, are always active in processes, I would say in transactions. They do not exist by themselves. They are not what they are by themselves. It's not a natural property or anything like that. Well, it is partly. The capacity of reflexivity is. We have a brain and we can do that. But what we think cannot be understood outside of the ongoing interactions that we have with other objects or other human interactants. Now, I will try to, if I have time, I will try to explain a little bit later that we cannot understand even the behaviors of slaves and these total, repressive, awful institutions without taking into account their self, their me, and their I. And we will see there's no structure there, I think, as external, constraining, enabling social forces. We have also different kinds of things in this list. Now, I'll go very quickly. The goals of the actors, I don't think I have to explain that. The emotions, I mean, there will be many things to say about that, but I think you can understand what it is, generally speaking. The values, the interests, the habits, and the capacity to mobilize resources. We find these concepts in different theories. I think they're all interdependent sub-dimensions of actions. We should not, like rational choice theory, for instance, overinflate one of these concepts at the expense of the other concepts. What is the most important sub-dimension of action? Well, that's an empirical question. And it depends on the actors, the interactants that you study, depends on the social fields, depends on the dynamics, depends on many things. But I don't think a good sociological theory should put the emphasis too much on one or several of these subdimensions of actions. The interactants should tell us what they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing. We should follow them, as Leto said in this, more or less in this logic. Perceptions of, but contextualized perceptions, that's very important. I will come back on this if I have time again. The notion of contextualize is crucial here. The perceptions of the other human and non-human actants that we are interacting with, the state, the form, the becoming of the social field in which we are. Is it collapsing? Does it seem to be solid? Do they really believe in it, the people I'm interacting with? Was it always like that? Do I think it's natural to be involved in a social field like that or not? Do I think it's constructed? All these things matter a lot to explain the behaviors, the actions of people. And then you have the characteristics of interactions. That was in the upper part of the graphic. So, I'll just go very quickly here. If you have questions about that, just ask them later. But the intensity of the interactions matter a lot. We can assume, very generally speaking, that the more intensive interactions are, the more important they become, but they should never be seen as external to the interactants. For me, it's illogical to think like that. Interactions are intensive because you have at least two actors that are deeply involved in these interactions. The modes of interactions, is it very repressive? Is it open? Is it more liberal? Is it the duration of interactions is important too, but not as external, constraining, enabling forces again. Just skip on that, but we can come back if you think I'm wrong here. The space of interactions, this is the geography of the interactions, is really important. If you think about the capacity of Brazilian slaves, for instance, to escape here during colonization, during the time of the slavery plantations, and you compare with the capacities, the possibilities of American slaves, British colonies, to escape, that was, relatively speaking, a little bit less difficult for Brazilian slaves because there was these huge forests, undeveloped spaces they could try to hide, which was more difficult elsewhere. But that's not an external constraining structural condition here. This is an interaction with a forest. This is an interaction with a mountain. This is an interaction with trees and rivers and so on. The level of creativity of the actor is also very, very important. It refers to the I here, but it's the creativity of the interactions here that we can study too, as a constant effect of interactions. So I think this way of seeing the social universe, social life, and this way of conducting sociological analysis is more, potentially at least more fruitful than, and more realistic than the two other options, the deterministic, co-deterministic approaches. And how much time do I still have? 5 to 10? Okay, so I'll have just enough time to use a couple of examples coming from these, from my preliminary readings on slave plantations. If you can just move next, yeah, and next one again. I'll skip next one, and maybe next one. No, the previous one. Okay. Where is it? No, the previous one again. Sorry. The one before. Okay. Whatever. It's okay. Doesn't matter. Okay, so I'm trying to use the examples, readings on slavery plantations, to show that this deep relational sociology approach is more productive, more fruitful, and more realistic than co-deterministic theories or deterministic theories. Now, can we identify some social structures of slavery plantations? My answer is yes, of course we can. Many sociologists have done it actually, and I found one text that proposed 9 elements of of structural characteristics or elements, as he called them, of slavery plantations. Now, can you just find this? I think it's the next one. Yeah, next one. Okay, stay there. That's okay.
Here.
No, that was the one before.
Sorry, no,
That's okay.
because,
That's okay. You can stay there. The next one. Okay, don't move. Okay, I'll switch there. So you have, I had the full list in the previous slide, but that's okay. We'll do it more quickly like that. Where is it? Now I'm lost with my own papers. And I'll go with this one. Okay, that's the first structural element or characteristic of a slavery plantation as defined by this unknown sociologist. Doesn't matter here, but his name is Durand. Published a good chapter, actually, a good article, a good text on trying to define the structural characteristics of a slavery plantation. And the first one on his list, there's 9 like that. Knowledge. So he wrote, beliefs about what is thought to be true. Owners' beliefs that slave labor was practical and profitable, slaves were human property, and slaves should be subordinate to their master. Maybe for the time I have, I'll just stick to this one. Right. Can we say this is a structural characteristic of slavery plantations at that time? For his text is about slavery plantations in South United States, to be more specific. But I think I would argue was pretty much in the Americas pretty much the same. It's valid. Right? So does it exist? Yes. As what? As a sociological representation of slavery plantations, it is relevant. It does exist. Not only Latour would say it does exist, of course, because it was produced by sociologists, and you have the text and so on. And the text can interact with other people. I would say with Latour, who's quite cynical in this way, I would say I agree with you, but it's more than that. This guy, this sociologist, studied many different slavery plantations, obviously read a lot on what social structures are, and he came with this general outcome, this general representation, that something we could find, generally speaking, in slavery plantations. Does it exist? Yes. Is it valid? Well, somewhere, somehow, yes, it is valid. Now, the question is, to come back to co-determinism and deep relational sociology, is it a structural condition that has causal powers on the actors, that had causal powers on the actors? My answer is, well, if I want to be very generous, and I want to have a lot of friends, I would say, very softly, yes, but very, very, very little. So little that it's almost insignificant. This is where I start to be very provocative. This is where usually I lose friends. But I don't think we should waste too much time or any time at all studying these things, because it had very little effects, if any, on these slaves at that time. Why? And I'll try to do it in 2 minutes to give you more time for the questions. Because, as Randall Collins and many others said, we have to keep in mind that this so-called social structure is a representation made by a sociologist. So we can ask the question, in terms of causal powers, did this sociological representation have any effect on the behaviors of slaves? Well, because of time issues, of course, the answer is no, because it was produced after. So it never had any effect. It could never had any effect on these slaves, because they were not even aware of the existence of sociology at that time. Second problem now, can we think that these slaves had their own structural representations, or representations of social structures of slavery plantations, in terms of knowledge, for instance, that could influence their actions? My answer is, again, this is where I say yes, very softly, but we have to be so careful that I would suggest just to forget about that, or again, not paying so much attention on this. Why? Well, because the way we define structures, social structures in sociology, we define them as general representation, general characteristics for it. Sorry, not representation, it's too subjectivist, but general characteristics of or conditions of a slavery plantation, for instance. But in order to get there, you have to, this is valid only if it's representative or if it was present in most, at least, of the slavery plantations at that time. If we're talking about description of 1 or 2 or 3 slavery plantations, this is not the social structure in the way we understand it in sociology. It's not general enough. Now, these slaves lived short time. In Brazil, the life expectancy of a slave in the it was early 19th century or late 18th century was 7 years. A short life. You can imagine why, because it was quite tough. Some lived longer, of course, and most of them, because it was short, very intensive, most of them lived in one slavery, their petty life, in one slavery plantation. Some 2, maybe 3 maximum, but no more than that. They could have some representations. They had, like everybody else, of course, representations of their social field, of what was going on, the plantation or the 2, 3 plantations in which they lived. That could, of course, influence their behaviors. I'm sure it did. They were like us. They were reflexive animals. So they understood their reality, the plantations, and they were influenced by that. But they were not influenced by a structure, social structures in the way we understand it in sociology, because they were influenced by the characteristics of 1 or 2 or 3 and their own knowledge of. Right? So to jump from these things that I can accept, these causal powers that I can accept, to the general idea or the general principle that social structures as pre-existing conditions, social structures of slavery plantations, for instance, cause or self-act on the actors, on the slaves, or interact with the slaves, then you lose me. I'll say, no, this is too vague principle, this is too general, and it's not realistic, because their life was not, they didn't interact with the structures of slavery plantations. They lived in very specific contextualized very few slavery plantations, and they interacted with masters, specific people, and there was a hierarchy of slaves too, and tools, and different, and the forest, and the mountain, and quilombos, and whatever you can imagine. But all these things were always very specific interactions, human or non-human interactions. And if you were a slave at that time, you knew that it mattered a lot. That didn't matter so much. But what mattered a lot for you was your master and the way he saw you, for instance. If he saw you like a cow or a tool, well, that was not good news. Right? At the best, he would protect you because he didn't want to lose a cow. He didn't want to lose the investment that he made in you. But your own life, sentiments, suffering, and so on, he didn't give a damn about that. As long as you survived and you were able to work next morning, that was fine. If you had to deal with a sadistic, cruel master, strong racist person who hated you like hell, who thought that you were like an animal, and he was alcoholic or something like that, well, that was a terrible news, because at some points in his life, in the week, he didn't care at all to lose his investment, and he could just kill you or torture you for absolutely no reason. I mean, there was never any reason for torturing a slave, but that could be like in a Nazi camp, for instance. You could be in the same level as a Jew in a Nazi camp or something close to it. If you had to deal with a liberal, because they existed, a liberal master who wanted to make profit with his slavery plantation, and he knew that he had to use, didn't have to, but he thought at least that he had to use slaves in order to make profits, but he saw you as a human being. And there were different kinds of relationships between masters and the slaves, from hate, cruelty, to even love in some cases. Well, if you were the slave, you were determined, if we want to think in this way, in terms of determination, more by what your master was and how he saw you than by the structures, the general structures of slavery plantations. Actually, you didn't give a damn about the structures of slavery plantations, but it was very important for you to know who's this master. Is he cruel? Is he liberal? Is this whatever? I lost the microphone, I think, by moving like that. So we can we can, my second, and I will stop here because we can do the same exercise with the 8 other elements. But the second thing is I think we can, you can stay there, that's okay. Okay, sentiments. We can reformulate all these so-called structural conditions or factors or forces in a relational way, in a deep relational way, with the concepts that I propose here in this. Don't move, it's okay. With this graphic. Like sentiments, what is it? Well, it refers to, whoops, I lost it, that's okay. With the self, the I, and the me, and the values probably of the interactions involved in the interactions. I'm not very clear. I'll use the knowledge, for instance, the first one. It can be easily reformulated from being seen as a structural condition to be seen as simply one of the subdimensions of interactions between interactants. What is knowledge? Well, it does refer in this case clearly to the self, the reflexivity of the actors, the me, the I, the goals, and so on. And we could go through the list like that. If we won't do it, that will be too long. Again, I want to stop here. I want to give you more time. But there's, for instance, the rank, the status, or the social inequalities. That matters a lot for many sociologists. And this is usually when they want to criticize what I'm saying, they focus on this one by saying, so you're saying that the structural inequalities between the masters and the slaves didn't matter for the slaves at that time. It did. Of course it did. The fact that the masters had access to rifles and the slaves didn't mattered a lot. But it doesn't have to be seen as a structural condition. It's just a very simple fact of life of these people. The master had rifles and these poor slaves didn't. But you know what? Sometimes the slaves managed to put their hands on rifles and they were in processes, in social processes where the master didn't have the rifle or not enough. And what happened was that in many cases, it happened many times in Brazil, for instance, but elsewhere, the masters were killed by the slaves. Not because the structural condition changed. We can talk in this way if you want, but I think it's much more flexible, realistic, and fruitful to just say, because these slaves organized themselves, usually in parties, in fiestas that they had. They started to build plans to escape, to kill the master, to burn the plantation, to join a quilombo or whatever it could be. And they worked hard for days and weeks and months to put their hands on rifles, on weapons that they could use eventually to and I will stop here, but if you look at the history of, especially since the Nova Historia, it's called in Portuguese, I think, since the 80s here, for instance, in Brazil, same more or less in the United States, many historians started to look at small things, well, things that look to be small, especially when we were thinking in structural ways, but were not. They discovered that slaves were much more active than we thought, that the image that we had, that they were simply repressed, powerless, dominated, tortured, and so on. It was all true, of course, in many cases, but there was much more there, much more there. And that, taking into account these specific social processes or social fields of resistance, of building small movements or networks or groups of resistance, connecting slaves from different plantations in different ways by using their imagination and a lot of creativity, actually, because it was difficult, of course, they managed to, to do plenty of things. I'll stop here, but in Haiti, for instance, they succeeded. There was a revolt, riots that turned out to be a revolution. Here you had, and I'll really stop here, but you know better than me, I'm sure, but you had a quilombo that lasted for almost, I think it was 90 years, something like that, the Palmeiras. That was something. That's really impressive. We estimate today that at one point there were something like 15,000 people living in this quilombo, most of them being, not all of them, but most of them being ex-slaves that managed to escape in one way or another. They resisted to the Portuguese armies for I think it was 75 years, 90 years, something like that, but many decades. And that was the exception in Brazil, but you had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these small communities created by slaves. And that can be hardly understood, if we use a co-deterministic or deterministic approach. Okay, that was rough, but